7-year-old girl sent a crayon drawing to a billionaire she'd never met. 3 months later, a man with a $340 million empire was sitting in a courtroom surrendering his passport. This is what happened in between. The city of Riverside never truly sleeps in December. 42 floors below Charles Whitmore's office window, the Grand Avenue traffic moved in slow, steady ribbons of red and white light, the rhythm of it almost hypnotic from this height. Christmas decorations strung between lampposts swayed in the cold Pacific wind. Every third storefront glowed with something festive, and even the construction scaffolding on the old Meridian block had been wrapped in strings of white bulbs by some contractor with a sense of occasion. From up here, the city looked the way cities always look from 42 stories. Beautiful, orderly, manageable. Like a problem with a solution already inside it, waiting to be found. Charles had always liked that view. It was one of the reasons he had chosen this office when they moved into the tower 11 years ago, and one of the reasons he still sat here, long after everyone else had gone home, reviewing the acquisition proposal that needed to be on his desk by Thursday morning. The proposal was for a regional medical group in Sacramento. $240 million, structured as a leveraged buyout with a 3-year integration timeline. A reasonable deal. Probably a good one. He had read the executive summary twice and was beginning on the financial appendices when Lydia knocked. Lydia Chun had been his executive assistant for 9 years. She knew exactly when interrupting him was worth the risk. She knocked twice and opened the door without waiting, which was the signal between them that she had already decided this mattered. "There's a letter, Mr. Whitmore." She crossed the room and set a small yellow envelope on the corner of his desk. The kind sold in multipacks at drugstore checkout counters. Along the seal flap, someone had placed a row of cartoon duck stickers, the adhesive kind that come in sheets meant for children's craft projects. His name was written on the front in purple crayon, in the careful block letters of a child who has learned that print is more legible than cursive and is trying very hard to be understood. "Hand-delivered to the lobby," Lydia said. The security desk called up. "No return address." The night guard said a woman dropped it off around 7, said her daughter had asked her to bring it. She left before anyone could get a name. He looked at the envelope without picking it up. Then he set down the acquisition proposal, reached past it, and picked up the yellow envelope instead. Inside was a single sheet of white printer paper, folded into quarters. When he opened it, he found a drawing on one side. 2 figures stood beneath a Christmas tree. One tall, one small. The tall one had hair drawn in tight purple spirals that went up and outward like a crown. The small one wore a hat with a red pom-pom tilted to one side. They were holding hands, a single thick orange line connecting them unbroken. Around them, the scene was dense with effort. Lopsided yellow stars that were more asterisk than pentagram, snowflakes with too many arms, a moon in the top corner that was closer to a lemon in shape but clearly intended as something celestial. In the top right, in the same careful purple block letters as on the envelope, "My mom and me." He looked at it for a while before he turned to the other side. The letter was written in pencil, each word placed with the deliberateness of a child who has thought carefully about what she wants to say, and is making sure the letters don't run away from her. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, my name is Zara. I am 7 years old. I do not want toys for Christmas because I only have one wish. My mom is very sick. She has kidney disease and the doctor says she needs a new kidney, but we don't have enough money. My mom tells me not to worry, but I can see she is in pain and moms don't like to scare their kids, so they lie a little. I am not scared. I just want her to get better. I read in the newspaper that you help people. I asked my teacher and she said you built hospitals and give money to sick people sometimes. I thought maybe you could help us too. I know you are very busy. I drew us so you know how much I love her. She is the best mom even when she is sick. She still reads to me every night even when her hands hurt. I am sorry if this letter is bad. I tried my best. Thank you for reading this. Love, Zara. Charles read it once. Then he set it down on the desk in front of him and looked at it. Then he read it again. He was not a man given to sentiment in professional settings. 30 years of high-stakes transactions had refined him into someone who processed information cleanly and made decisions without drama. But he sat very still for several minutes, and the $240 million acquisition proposal remained exactly where it was, unread, at the edge of the desk. He read the letter a third time. He kept stopping on the same line. She still reads to me every night even when her hands hurt. He pressed the intercom. Lydia, I need an address. Whatever it takes tonight. A child named Zara, mother with kidney disease, somewhere in the city. Check the security camera timestamp from when the letter was dropped off. See if we can trace a vehicle, get a better description. I want an address before I leave. Pause on the line. It's almost midnight, Mr. Whitmore. I know what time it is. Another pause. I'll call you when I have something. He hung up and looked out the window at the city, at the 42 floors of distance between himself and the ground where people lived their lives and sent their 7-year-old daughter's drawings to strangers because they had run out of other options. He thought about a woman who read to her child every night even when her hands hurt. He thought about a 7-year-old who knew that her mother was lying, just a little, to protect her, and had decided that the kindest thing she could do in return was to ask a stranger for help so her mother wouldn't have to. He left the acquisition proposal on his desk and went home. At 2:17 in the morning, Lydia texted him an address on Drummond Street. He set his alarm for 6. Magnolia East was not what the name suggested. The name suggested something botanical, something deliberate. Magnolias, after all, are not accidental flowers. But the building at the corner of Drummond and 14th was 4 stories of pale brick that had been the color of cream once and was now the color of old newspaper, stained in long vertical streaks from decades of rain running unchecked from gutters that had long since stopped functioning as intended. The facade had that specific quality of disrepair that communicates not crisis but surrender. Not a building in the middle of falling apart, but one that had already fallen and simply continued to stand out of structural inertia. Charles arrived at 8:15 on a cold December morning, wearing his work overcoat, carrying nothing. He was aware of how he looked, aware that a man in an expensive coat stepping out of a black SUV in front of this building was a specific kind of visual statement. He had decided on the drive over that the only thing to do was be straightforward. No performance, no orchestrated warmth. Just present. The lobby door opened with a push. The lock had been broken for long enough that no one had taped a notice about it anymore. The elevator doors were closed, and a handwritten sign taped to them at eye level read, "Out of service, maintenance in progress." Below the printed text, someone had added in pen, quietly and without drama, "Since April." He walked up 4 flights. The stairwell smelled of something damp and organic, the kind of smell that belongs in basements, not in the places where people come home every day. He found 4C at the end of the 4th floor hallway and knocked. A long pause. Small footsteps. Then the door opened 3 inches, held by the brass chain, and a face appeared in the gap. 1 large dark eye, warm brown skin, 2 neat braids tied in pink rubber bands, and the particular expression of a 7-year-old who has been taught, correctly, not to trust strangers at the door. "Are you Zara?" he asked. The eye studied him with a thoroughness that most adults had long since abandoned. "Who are you?" "My name is Charles Whitmore. You wrote me a letter." A pause. The eye went wide. The door closed and he heard urgent whispering on the other side. A child's voice and a lower adult voice, the words indistinct but the tone unmistakable. The quick negotiation of a surprised household deciding what to do about an unexpected visitor. Then the chain scraped back. The door opened fully. Zara was small for 7, with the eyes of a child who had not yet learned to look away from difficult things. She wore pajamas printed with cartoon elephants. She looked at him the way children look at things they have wished for very hard but never quite believed would actually arrive. Not surprise exactly, more like the slow arrival of something already known. "You came," she said. "I came," he said. She stepped back and held the door open and let him in. The apartment was small and scrupulously clean. The kind of clean that is a daily choice, a quiet refusal to be diminished by circumstances. Zara's schoolbooks were stacked in a neat tower beside the window. A string of hand-cut paper stars, gold marker on manila folder stock, was taped above the kitchen doorway in lieu of any other Christmas decoration. From the bedroom a voice. "Who is it, baby?" And Zara, standing very straight. "It's Mr. Whitmore, Mama. The man I wrote to." Naomi Carter was sitting up in bed with her back straight, and the blanket arranged around her with the unconscious formality of someone who had decided she was not going to be caught lying down by a stranger, no matter how she felt. She was 34 and she looked both younger and older than that simultaneously. Younger because her face in repose held a quiet beauty, older because illness had hollowed out something behind her eyes that rest alone couldn't restore. On her nightstand, a medication organizer, a glass of water, a stack of bills folded small as if to make them feel smaller, and a thick library book. He could read the spine from where he stood. Advanced Principles of Contract Law, 5th edition. She was studying. Even now. Even here. "Mr. Whitmore." Her voice was careful and even. "I didn't know Zara had written to you. She knew I would have stopped her." "I know," he said. He pulled the wooden chair near the window to the side of her bed and sat down. Not hovering, not looming, but level. "She mentioned that in the letter," she said. "She said moms don't like to scare their kids, so they lie a little." Something moved across Naomi's face, quick and honest, before the composure returned. "She's observant." "She is." A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind in which two people are deciding whether to trust each other. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Whitmore," Naomi said. "I want to be clear about that from the beginning. Whatever you've come here to offer, I want to understand what it is before I accept or decline anything." "That's fair," he said. "So tell me, why did you actually come?" He thought about the letter, about the drawing, about the paper stars above the kitchen door, and the contract law textbook on the nightstand, about a woman who read to her child every night even when her hands hurt. "Because your daughter drew me a picture," he said, "and I think I owe it to her to find out what it was trying to tell me." Naomi looked at him steadily. He looked back. In the doorway, Zara watched them both with the focused attention of a child who understands that something important is happening and wants to remember it. "All right," Naomi said at last. "Then sit down, Mr. Whitmore, and I'll tell you everything." She told it without self-pity, which made it harder to hear. She had grown up in Riverside, East Side, the daughter of a hospital orderly and a school cafeteria manager, two people who worked every day of their lives and gave her a childhood that was tight in money and rich in everything else. She had been, from early on, the kind of student who made teachers pay attention. She had won a scholarship, worked 2 jobs through university, graduated with a business degree, and gotten a position at a logistics company in the city. She had been promoted twice in 4 years. She had started her paralegal certification in the evenings because she believed that the law was the architecture of the world she lived in, and she intended to understand the architecture. Then her daughter was born. Then Zara's father left. She described it the way someone reports a weather event, without bitterness, just accurate. Then the fatigue started. Persistent, deepening, unresponsive to sleep. The swelling in her ankles, the headaches, the way her concentration occasionally dissolved mid-sentence. She had dismissed it for 2 years because she could not afford to be sick. She was raising Zara alone, she was working, she was studying, and sick was a category she had temporarily closed access to. She dismissed it right up until the day she passed out on the bus home from work and woke up in the emergency room. Stage 4 chronic kidney disease. 18% function. Without a transplant, critical failure in 8 to 14 months. With dialysis 3 sessions a week for hours each, she could manage symptoms and buy time. But dialysis was maintenance, not solution. The transplant was the only path to a real life. The transplant cost $195,000. Her insurance covered $40,000. She had saved $8,300. She had applied for 3 financial assistance programs. 2 had waiting lists longer than her prognosis. 1 had denied her because she owned a car. A 2011 Honda with 140,000 miles that she needed to get Zara to school because the bus route had changed. She said this without irony, which somehow made it worse. "And the building?" Charles asked quietly. "How long have you been here?" 3 years. The ventilation has never worked properly. There's moisture in the walls, dark patches near the ceiling every winter, and a smell I can't get rid of. The water has a taste I don't trust, so I filter it. I've submitted 4 written complaints to the management company. I received 2 form letters saying the issues were under review. Nothing has changed. She said it the way people say things they have already spent a long time being angry about and have arrived on the other side of that anger at something more durable. A clear-eyed understanding of exactly how they have been failed, without the luxury of despair. When Charles finally stood to leave, Zara walked him to the door. At the threshold, she looked up at him with her large, serious eyes. "Did you like my drawing?" she asked. "I thought it was one of the best drawings I've ever been sent." She evaluated this carefully, the particular look of a child deciding whether she is being humored or told the truth. Apparently she decided on the latter. "I worked very hard on the stars," she said. "They're harder than they look." "I believe that. You can keep it." "Thank you, Zara." "You're welcome, Mr. Whitmore." She closed the door. He stood in the dim hallway for a moment, in the flickering light, with the smell of mold quiet in the air around him. Then he took out his phone and called Marcus Bell. "I need a full structural and environmental assessment of a building," he said. "Magnolia East, corner of Drummond and 14th. Air quality, water, structural, maintenance history, violation records, ownership. Everything. And Marcus, find out who actually owns this building. Actually. All the way down. How far down do you think it goes?" Charles looked at the elevator doors at the end of the hall. At the handwritten note taped below the out-of-service sign. "Since April." "Far enough," he said, "that they thought no one would follow." Marcus Bell had spent 11 years working for Charles Whitmore, and before that, 9 years as a federal housing inspector, which meant that by the time he walked into Magnolia East on the morning of December 23 with an air quality kit, a water testing kit, a thermal imaging camera, and the particular expression of a man who already suspected what he was going to find, he had seen more than 400 buildings in various states of neglect, decay, and deliberate ruin. He had seen slumlords who didn't know their buildings were falling apart. He had seen slumlords who knew and didn't care. And he had seen, rarely but memorably, slumlords who knew, cared very much, and had structured their entire operation around making sure that knowledge stayed locked inside the walls. He could tell, within 20 minutes of entering Magnolia East, that this was the third kind. The lobby told him almost nothing. Lobbies were often presentable, a concession to city inspectors who rarely went further. But the stairwell told him more. The smell hit him on the second-floor landing. Not the surface mold smell of a single damp wall, but the deep systemic smell of moisture that has been living inside a structure long enough to become part of it. He knew that smell. It meant the water was not coming from outside. It was coming from within. A ventilation system that had been failing for long enough to reverse the pressure differential, pulling damp air from the walls into the living spaces instead of pushing fresh air through them. He knocked on 8 apartment doors across all 4 floors. 6 residents answered. All 6, without being asked, said some version of the same thing. The air felt heavy. It was hard to breathe in winter. There was a smell that came and went. They had complained. Nothing had happened. He ran his air quality tests in 4 apartments. The mold spore counts came back at 240% of the EPA's recommended danger threshold in the lowest result, and 380% in the highest. He photographed the dark bloom spreading from the corner of a ceiling in apartment 3B, the streaking behind a radiator in 2D, the blackened grout lines in the bathroom of 4A that had been painted over. He could see the outline of the old growth beneath the new paint, the way a body leaves an impression in a mattress. Someone had painted over the mold rather than treat it. That was not an accident. That was a choice. The water tests were worse. The filtration system serving the building had a corroded coupling on its primary seal. The kind of corrosion that develops over years, not months, and trace levels of lead and copper were leaching into the water supply from the degraded pipes downstream of the break. Not enough to cause acute poisoning. Enough, over months and years, to suppress immune function, damage kidney tissue, increase the risk of cardiovascular disease in people already vulnerable to it. He stood in the basement next to the filtration unit for a long time, looking at the corroded coupling. He took photographs from 4 angles. He noted the oxidation pattern on the surrounding pipe, a pattern consistent with at least 16 months of continuous exposure. He noted the timestamp on the last maintenance log entry clipped to the wall beside the unit. April 7th, 18 months ago. The entry said, "Unit inspected. Functioning within acceptable parameters." Signed by a company called Lakeview Property Services. He called Charles from the parking lot. The air quality is 3 to 4 times above the danger threshold for mold. The water filtration seal has been corroding for approximately 16 months, possibly longer. There are lead and copper traces in the supply. The last maintenance log entry is 18 months old and lists the unit as functioning within acceptable parameters, which it was not then and is not now. Someone either didn't check or checked and wrote down something other than what they found. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Charles said, "For a kidney patient. She has been living in this for 16 months. Yes." Another silence. Is it negligence? Marcus looked back at the building, at the pale brick stained with years of unchecked rain, at the dark gap where a downspout had separated from the wall and been left to drain wherever it chose. "Negligence is when you don't know," he said, "or when you know and you forget. There's a maintenance log 18 months old that says everything was fine. Whatever was wrong with that seal 18 months ago didn't develop overnight. It was already there when someone signed that log. Whoever signed it either didn't look or looked and lied. Either way, this isn't forgetting. This is a decision. Find out who owns it," Charles said. "All the way down. Already started." It took Bell 36 hours and 3 layers of corporate filings across 2 states to find the name at the center. He had done this kind of tracing before in his federal years. Following money through shell companies was a standard part of certain investigations, and he knew what it looked like when a structure had been built to resist exactly that kind of tracing. Most ownership structures were complicated because business was complicated. Partners, investors, holding companies, all the ordinary machinery of commerce layered over time. But some structures were complicated because someone had sat down and deliberately engineered the complication. The difference was in the architecture. Accidental complexity had loose ends, redundancies, the fingerprints of improvisation. Deliberate complexity was clean. Each layer served a precise function. The whole thing had the quality of something designed. The building at Magnolia East was owned by a company called Drummond East Property LLC. Drummond East Property LLC was itself owned by a company called Eastside Community Holdings LLC. Eastside Community Holdings was owned by a company called Pacific Residential Group LLC. Pacific Residential Group was owned by a company called Cornerstone Asset Management LLC. Cornerstone Asset Management was owned by a family trust called the Riverside Family Legacy Trust, registered in Delaware. The Riverside Family Legacy Trust had a single trustee, a man named Marcus Cole. Bell looked at the name on his screen for a long moment. Then he searched Marcus Cole in the Riverside Business Journal archive. The first result was a profile from 6 months ago, headlined, "A New Model of the Socially Conscious Entrepreneur." The photograph showed a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with silver at his temples and a smile that had been calibrated over many years to communicate exactly the right amount of warmth, enough to seem genuine, not so much as to seem effortful. The article described Cole as a self-made property developer who had spent 20 years building affordable housing on the east side of Riverside, while simultaneously chairing the board of 2 nonprofit housing advocacy organizations. He attended galas. He gave speeches about community investment. He had been photographed with the mayor, with state senators, with the director of the city's community development office. 3 paragraphs from the end, the article mentioned, almost in passing, that Cole had recently been named to the advisory board of a regional fair housing coalition. A man who sat on a fair housing board, who owned 28 buildings through 4 layers of LLC, whose buildings had mold counts at 380% of the danger threshold, whose water filtration units had been leaking heavy metals into the supply for over a year, whose maintenance logs were 18 months out of date. Bell called Charles again. His name is Marcus Cole. He's a property developer, mid-50s, well-connected. Publicly, he's a housing advocate. He sits on nonprofit boards. He's photographed with politicians. Privately, he owns 28 buildings on the east side through a chain of 4 LLCs terminating in a Delaware family trust. The structure is not accidental. It's been built so that any legal action against a specific building runs into an empty shell. You'd need to pierce 4 corporate veils to get to him, and you'd need to prove fraud to do that, which requires resources most of his tenants don't have. How long has he been operating this way? Based on the registration dates of the LLCs, at least 12 years. Charles said nothing for a moment. Bell could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, the measured, even breathing of a man processing something. "There's more," Bell said. "Tell me." I pulled tenant data across all 28 buildings. Demographics, complaint records, maintenance response rates, health incident reports were available from public records. There's a pattern. The buildings with the worst conditions, worst maintenance, highest violation counts, lowest response rates to complaints, have tenant populations that are 76% Black or Hispanic. The buildings in marginally better condition have higher percentages of white tenants. The correlation is consistent across all 28 properties over 5 years. It's not random variation. The worst conditions are concentrated where the tenants are most likely to have the fewest resources to fight back. The silence on the line was longer this time. And there's something else, Bell continued. I ran a title search and cross-reference with commercial real estate filings. Cole is in active negotiations to sell all 28 buildings to a development group called Meridian Partners. The sale price being discussed is $340 million. The expected closing date is February 15th, 7 weeks from now. Upon sale, all existing tenants would receive 60-day eviction notices. We're talking about hundreds of families in February, in a city where the average wait for subsidized housing is 11 months. He's been running the buildings into the ground to suppress their book value for tax purposes, Charles said. It wasn't a question. While negotiating a sale price based on the land's development potential, which has nothing to do with the current condition of the buildings, the land is worth far more than the structures on it. The structures are a liability on paper and an asset in the deal. He's been extracting rent revenue for 12 years with near zero maintenance costs, reducing his taxable income through manufactured losses, and now he's going to sell for $340 million to a buyer who will demolish everything and build luxury condominiums. The tenants are not incidental to the plan. They're part of the financial architecture. Their presence keeps the book value low. Their suffering is a tax strategy. Charles was quiet for a long time after that. Bell waited. He had learned in 11 years that Charles Whitmore's silences were not empty. They were the space in which decisions were made, fully, completely, with all the weight properly distributed before anything was committed to. Get me everything you have, Charles said finally. Every document, every photograph, every data point. I want it organized and I want it tonight. And Marcus. Yeah. Good work. Bell looked at the photograph of Marcus Cole on his screen. The warm smile, the silver temples, the ease of a man entirely comfortable with being photographed next to people with power. It's not done yet, he said. No, Charles agreed. It's just started. He hung up. Bell sat for a moment in the quiet of his car, parked outside Magnolia East in the gray December afternoon, looking up at the building's stained facade. Somewhere on the 4th floor in apartment 4C, a woman with failing kidneys was living in air that was slowly making her worse, drinking water filtered through a pitcher she bought herself because something about the tap made her daughter's stomach hurt, folding her medical bills small to make them feel smaller, and reading contract law so that she would understand someday exactly the mechanism of what had been done to her. She had already understood more than most people ever would. She just hadn't had a name to put on it yet. Marcus Cole. Now she did. Tell us where you heard this story and what you think of the little girl's letter. Eleanor Shaw arrived at Charles Whitmore's office at 7 in the morning on December 26th, 2 days after Christmas, with a yellow legal pad, a coffee she had made herself rather than accepting from the lobby service, and the particular quality of stillness that she carried into rooms where serious things were about to be decided. She had been Charles's lead attorney for 14 years. In that time, she had taken on pharmaceutical companies that had buried clinical data, contractors who had submitted fraudulent bids on 3 consecutive city projects, and at least 2 attempts by competing corporations to acquire Whitmore capital through mechanisms that were, in her precise legal opinion, fraudulent. She had won each time. Not because she was lucky, and not because she was ruthless, though she could be when the situation required it, but because she was thorough in a way that most opposing counsel, meeting her for the first time, consistently underestimated. She was 55 years old. She was black. She wore her hair natural and her suits well fitted, and she had a way of listening to people that made them feel, accurately, that she was hearing not just what they were saying but what they meant. Charles trusted her judgment more than he trusted almost anyone's. And he trusted it specifically because she did not tell him what he wanted to hear. She had reviewed Marcus Bell's complete findings the night before, and had spent the remainder of the night thinking. When she sat down across from Charles and opened her legal pad, the first page was filled with her small, dense handwriting, notes organized not chronologically but structurally, the way a person organizes things when they have already decided on a course of action and are now working out the precise sequence of execution. For simultaneous lines of attack, she said, before she had fully settled into her chair. We move on all of them at once. He has built his defenses assuming he'll face one threat at a time. That's what the LLC structure is designed for. One tenant, one complaint, one proceeding. The structure absorbs it. We don't give him that. We hit 4 fronts simultaneously with 4 different agencies, each of which has independent authority to act. He cannot defend 4 fronts with the resources he'd use to kill one. Walk me through it, Charles said. First, the City Housing Authority. We file a formal complaint with full documentation tomorrow morning. The air quality data, the water test results, the complete maintenance violation history, the signed maintenance log entry from 18 months ago, and a timeline showing explicitly that the company had documentation of the ventilation failure while a medically vulnerable tenant was living in the building. We request emergency remediation orders and, critically, we request suspension of the rental license for Magnolia East pending inspection of all 28 properties in the portfolio. Not one building, all 28. That forces the city to look at the pattern, not just the incident. Second, federal. We file a Fair Housing Act complaint with HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The demographic pattern data that Bell compiled is exactly the kind of systemic evidence that fair housing cases are built on. 76% Black and Hispanic tenants in the worst condition buildings, sustained over 5 years, across 28 properties. That is not coincidence, and it is not a local housing complaint. That is a federal civil rights violation. HUD has subpoena power. They can compel production of records that a local housing authority cannot. Third, the deal. Meridian Partners, the buyers. We send their legal team a formal notice of ongoing federal investigation today. I can have it drafted and delivered within 2 hours of leaving this room. Any sophisticated buyer receiving formal notice of a federal fair housing investigation on a portfolio they're about to acquire is going to stop. If they proceed with knowledge of an active federal inquiry, they inherit the liability exposure. Their counsel will not allow that. The $340 million sale freezes. That's Cole's exit strategy. That's the whole point of everything he's built. We take it off the table before he even knows we've moved. Fourth, criminal referral. The tax structure, using deliberately suppressed building conditions to manufacture paper losses while negotiating a sale price that bears no relationship to those stated losses. That is potentially wire fraud and tax evasion under federal statute. We refer it to the state attorney general and the IRS simultaneously, and let each of them decide independently whether to open a criminal investigation. We are not making the allegation ourselves. We are putting the evidence in front of the people whose job it is to evaluate it. Charles had been listening without interruption. He nodded once through each point the way a person nods when they are confirming that the thing being said matches the thing they were already thinking. Timeline, he said. City complaint tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. notice to Meridian today, before close of business. Federal HUD complaint by end of the week, once I've verified the evidentiary format they require. Criminal referral by Friday. She paused. All 4 land within 72 hours. He wakes up on Saturday morning and he's being looked at from 4 directions simultaneously, by 4 entities that don't coordinate with each other, each of which has its own independent authority to act. Charles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And Naomi?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "That's the fifth line. And it's different from the others." "Different how?" "The other four are about systems, about structures and violations and precedents. They will take time, months, possibly more than a year before final resolutions. Naomi Carter has 8 months before her doctors expect critical failure. Those two timelines do not align." She set her pen down on the legal pad. "If we want to actually help her, not win a case in her name after she's gone, but help her, the person, in the time she has, we need to act on her medical situation as a completely separate track, moving at a completely different speed." "What do you need from me?" "A conversation with the head of transplant medicine at Whitmore Medical. Today if possible. And Charles, she told you she doesn't accept charity. That's not a small thing and we shouldn't treat it as one. We need to be precise about what we are offering her and why, because if we frame it wrong, she will refuse it, and she would be right to." Charles thought about Naomi Carter sitting up straight against her pillows. The medication organizer. The contract law textbook. The way she had said, clearly and without apology, "I don't accept charity. I want to understand what this is before I accept or decline anything." "So what do we call it?" he asked. Eleanor picked up her pen again. "We call it what it is. The city allowed a landlord to operate an illegal and discriminatory housing system for 12 years. That system put a vulnerable woman in an environment that accelerated the progression of a life-threatening illness. The cost of her treatment is a direct consequence of a failure of the systems that were supposed to protect her. What we are offering is not charity. It is an acknowledgement of that chain of causation and an attempt to address the harm it caused. That is not charity. That is accountability." Charles looked at her for a moment. "Use those exact words when you speak to her." "I intend to." She closed her legal pad, capped her pen, and stood. The meeting had lasted 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, the trajectory of Marcus Cole's life had been irrevocably altered, though he did not yet know it. He was, at that moment, likely sleeping in the large house in the north part of the city that his property portfolio had purchased for him, or perhaps already at his desk, or perhaps at the gym he attended 3 mornings a week, the one with the view of the river. He was living his ordinary life, which was to say a life constructed on the systematic extraction of money from people who had no real power to stop him, and doing so with a clean conscience, or at least with a conscience that had made its peace with what it knew and chosen not to look further than was comfortable. "One more thing," Eleanor said, pausing at the door. "Yes. When this goes public, and it will go public, your instinct is going to be to manage the narrative, to be visible, to be the person in the story who did the right thing. I know you, Charles, and I know that instinct is not vanity. It's habit. It's 30 years of understanding that visible action signals credible commitment." She looked at him with the directness that was the quality he valued most in her. "Resist it. This is not your story to manage. The moment you become the center of it, it becomes about the two of you, 2 powerful men, 1 conflict, and all the complexity of what Cole has actually done gets flattened into a headline about a business dispute. The story that needs to be told is the story of 67 families. And that story belongs to them." Charles held her gaze. "You're saying step back. I'm saying step out of the way. There is a difference. Stepping back means disengaging. Stepping out of the way means making sure that the people whose story this actually is have the space, the resources, and the support to tell it themselves, and then getting out of the frame so they can." He thought about this for a long time after she left. He stood at his window, the same window where, 4 nights ago, He had looked down at the city and seen the $240 million acquisition proposal sitting on his desk and a yellow envelope with duck stickers on its flap sitting beside it. He had chosen the envelope. That choice had led here. He thought about what Eleanor had said. The story belongs to them. He thought about Zara, standing in the doorway of her mother's bedroom with the focused attention of a child who understands that something important is happening and wants to remember it. He thought about Naomi saying, "She knew I would have stopped her." He thought about 67 families who had been filling out complaint forms and receiving form letters and filling out more complaint forms for years, because the system had been designed to exhaust them before they could reach anything real. He called his communications director and told her to hold all press inquiries related to housing or East Side property developments until further notice, with no comment and no indication of future comment. Then he called the housing advocacy organizations, 3 of them, the ones whose work he had funded quietly over the years without attaching his name to it, because Eleanor had told him 5 years ago that anonymous funding was more valuable than named funding for organizations that needed to be seen as independent. He told each of them what Bell had found. He told them about the 67 families. He offered them resources, legal support, investigative documentation, whatever they needed, and asked only one thing in return: that they lead the community outreach themselves. His name would not be on the invitation. His attorneys would not be in the room. He would provide the infrastructure and stay home. The director of the largest of the 3 organizations, a woman named Patricia who had been doing this work for 22 years, was quiet for a moment after he finished. "Most people who fund us want their name on the building," she said. "I know," Charles said. "Why don't you?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because a 7-year-old girl drew me a picture," he said. "And what she drew was not a picture of me." Another pause. Then Patricia said, "We'll start making calls tonight." On December 27th at 7 in the morning, Eleanor Shaw filed a 43-page complaint with the Riverside City Housing Authority, with full documentation attached. At 11:45 the same morning, a formal notice of federal investigation was delivered by courier to the legal department of Meridian Partners. The paralegal who signed for it brought it immediately to the senior partner handling the coal acquisition. The partner read the first 2 pages, set it down, and picked up the phone. The $340 million deal was placed on indefinite hold before the end of the business day. Marcus Cole received notification of the city complaint at 4 in the afternoon, forwarded by the management company's attorney with a 3-word note: "Call me immediately." He called. He listened. When he hung up, he sat for a moment in the quiet of his office, the large, well-appointed office in the north part of the city, with its framed photographs of handshakes and galas and award ceremonies, and he understood, with the clear-eyed accuracy of a man who had built a careful thing and could now feel it beginning to shift, that something had changed. He did not yet know who had moved against him. He did not yet know the full scope of what was coming. But he had been in business long enough to know the difference between an isolated complaint and the opening move of something larger. This was the opening move of something larger. He picked up his phone and called his attorneys. "Get everyone in the room," he said. "Tonight." Marcus Cole had not built a $340 million empire by being slow to recognize danger. He had recognized it the moment his attorney described the city complaint. Not from the specifics of the filing, which were serious enough, but from the way the attorney described it. 43 pages, full documentation, air quality data, water test results, maintenance timeline, demographic pattern analysis across all 28 properties. Nobody filed a 43-page city housing complaint about one building. That was not a complaint. That was the opening page of a case that someone had been building for a while and was now choosing to show. He spent the evening of December 27th in a conference room with his attorneys, 6 of them, the senior partners of the most expensive firm in the state, the kind of firm that billed at rates that made most people's eyes water and that had, over 30 years, developed a near-perfect record of making serious problems become manageable problems and manageable problems become resolved problems. They reviewed the city complaint together. They reviewed the notice to Meridian Partners. They discussed the probable shape of what was coming. The attorneys gave him the standard picture: defend, delay, negotiate. File motions challenging the scope of the investigation. Contest the methodology of the air quality testing. Argue that the LLC structure was a standard and entirely legal business arrangement. Seek to have any fair housing complaint narrowed to Magnolia East specifically rather than applied across the full portfolio. Negotiate a remediation settlement with the city that closed the complaint without admissions. Buy time. Outlast. Cole listened carefully to all of it. Then he said, "Who filed the city complaint?" His lead attorney checked his notes. The complainant is listed as the Riverside Housing Rights Coalition. It's one of the local advocacy organizations. They've been active in this area for about 8 years. And who funded the investigation? The air quality testing, the water testing, the demographic analysis. That's not something a small advocacy organization does on its own budget. The attorney paused. "We don't know yet." "Find out," Cole said. "Tonight if possible." It took until the following morning. The answer, when it came, settled into the room with the weight of something that changes the shape of everything around it. Charles Whitmore. Cole sat with that name for a long time. He knew Whitmore, not personally, but the way anyone in Riverside's business community knew the major figures in it. By reputation, by the size of the shadow they cast, by the way other people's posture changed when the name came up in conversation. Whitmore Capital. Healthcare and property primarily. 42 floors on Grand Avenue. A reputation for being thorough and difficult to outmaneuver. And a property and healthcare portfolio that, if Cole thought about it carefully, and he was thinking about it very carefully now, had interests that were adjacent to his own. The East Side. The development corridor. The land that Meridian Partners wanted to build on. He turned to his lead attorney. "Whitmore has real estate interests on the East Side." "Some, yes. Primarily commercial. His healthcare facilities are the most significant footprint. And he funds housing advocacy organizations." "Apparently." Cole nodded slowly. He was not thinking about defending the city complaint anymore. He was thinking about something else entirely, something that had come to him in the space between his attorney's answer and his next question, arriving with the clean precision of a solution that fits a problem exactly. He had been in business for 20 years. He had survived 3 recessions, 2 regulatory investigations, and 1 hostile takeover attempt. He had survived all of them not by being the strongest fighter in the room but by being the most adaptable, by finding the frame that made his position the defensible one and his opponent's position the one that required explanation. The frame was already there. He could see it clearly. Charles Whitmore was a white billionaire. Cole was a black entrepreneur who had spent 20 years building affordable housing in black and brown communities. Whitmore had funded an investigation that threatened to destroy everything Cole had built. Whitmore had real estate interests in the same corridor. The Meridian deal, the $340 million sale, would, if it collapsed, potentially benefit Whitmore's adjacent holdings by removing a competitor from the development landscape. None of that proved anything. All of it implied something. In the right hands, implication was more powerful than proof. He called his communications firm the next morning. Not the modest PR company he used for ordinary press releases, but the expensive one, the one that had managed crisis narratives for 3 governors and a Fortune 500 company, facing a product liability scandal. He told them what he needed. They told him it would cost a significant amount of money and could be ready to launch within 72 hours. 48, Cole said. They said they would try. The story, as it emerged across local media and social platforms over the first week of January, was precisely constructed. The headline, in various forms across various outlets: prominent Black developer targeted by white billionaire in possible real estate power play. The narrative ran like this: Marcus Cole, a self-made Black entrepreneur who had dedicated his career to providing affordable housing for Riverside's underserved communities, was facing a coordinated attack from Charles Whitmore, a white billionaire whose company had financial interests that would benefit from the disruption of Cole's operations and the collapse of the Meridian deal. The housing complaint was framed not as a response to documented violations but as a pretext, a legal mechanism deployed by a man with resources and connections to destroy a competitor under cover of social concern. The fair housing angle was described, carefully but unmistakably, as a cynical appropriation of civil rights language by a wealthy white man to serve his own financial interests. Cole gave a podcast interview. He was measured and sorrowful, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who has been genuinely hurt by something he didn't see coming. He spoke about his grandmother, who had been unable to buy a house in certain Riverside neighborhoods when she arrived in the city. He spoke about what it meant to him to have built affordable housing in communities that had historically been shut out of decent housing options. He spoke about the 23 years he had spent in this work, the relationships he had built, the families he had helped house. He said, "I've spent my life trying to do something real for this community. And now I'm watching a man who has never lived east of Grand Avenue use my community's pain as a weapon against me. I find that deeply troubling, and I think people of good faith need to ask themselves who benefits from this. Because it isn't the tenants, and it isn't the community. The only person who benefits is the one who filed the complaint." The clip moved quickly. The comments were divided. Some people found it compelling, some were skeptical, some were angry in different directions, but the division itself was the point. A divided audience is a confused audience, and a confused audience cannot sustain clear moral pressure. Cole needed the story to become complicated. He needed it to become about motives and power dynamics and who was using whom, rather than about mold counts and corroded water seals and a woman with kidney disease living in an apartment that was making her sicker. It was, Charles had to acknowledge when Eleanor briefed him, the smartest move available to a man in Cole's position. It cost nothing to allege. It was extremely difficult to disprove in the short term, and it weaponized the very thing that made the original story powerful: the racial dimension of who was being harmed, by introducing a counter-narrative in which the racial dimension pointed in a different direction. "He's trying to make it about us," Eleanor said. "Two powerful men. One conflict. In that frame, both sides have equivalent standing, and all the evidence we've compiled becomes just one side of a dispute rather than documentation of systematic harm. What do we do?" Charles asked. "Nothing," Eleanor said. "We do nothing. We do not respond to the podcast. We do not issue a statement. We do not brief friendly journalists. We do not defend your reputation or your motives because the moment we do, we have accepted his frame. We've agreed that this is a story about you and him. We let him talk. And we accelerate the one thing he cannot control, which is the community meeting." Patricia's team has already made contact with tenants in all 28 buildings. 41 families have confirmed they will attend. More are considering. We move the date up, hold it within the week before his narrative has time to fully set. And we make sure that what happens in that room is not about you, not about him, not about two powerful men arguing over money and motives. It is about Dorothy, who has submitted 14 maintenance requests in 3 years. It is about James, whose 8-year-old son has asthma. It is about Keisha, who was offered a bribe to withdraw a complaint and refused and had her rent raised the following month. Those are not stories that can be reframed. Those are people speaking plainly about what happened to them. No counter-narrative survives that. Charles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does Naomi want?" Eleanor had spoken to Naomi the previous day, a conversation that had lasted nearly 2 hours, in which Eleanor had used exactly the words Charles had told her to use. Not charity, accountability. Naomi had listened without interrupting, asked 12 precise and difficult questions, and at the end said that she would think about it and call back in the morning. She had called back in 45 minutes. "She wants to speak at the meeting," Eleanor said. She asked specifically whether she would be able to say what she wanted to say without it being managed or shaped by anyone on our side. "And you told her?" "I told her that what she says is hers to say. We are providing a room and a microphone. The words belong entirely to her." "Good," Charles said. "That's the only correct answer." He paused. Then quietly, "Is she well enough?" She said, and I'm quoting her directly, "I have been waiting 3 years for someone to give me a room and a microphone. I am well enough." He looked out the window at the January sky, flat and gray above the city. Marcus Cole was at this moment somewhere in that city, giving interviews and briefing journalists and deploying a PR firm that was very good at what it did. He was working hard and intelligently, and with the confidence of a man who had outmaneuvered obstacles before and believed he understood the mechanics of this one. He did not understand the mechanics of this one, because the mechanics of this one were not about 2 powerful men. They were about a woman who had been folding her medical bills small to make them feel smaller, and a daughter who had drawn a picture and sent it to a stranger because she could not think of anything else to do, and 66 other families whose names Cole had never learned and whose faces he would not have recognized, and who had been filling out complaint forms and receiving form letters for years because the system had been designed to make them feel that nothing they said would ever reach anyone who could change anything. The meeting was scheduled for January 11th at Greater Grace Community Church on Drummond Street. Charles put the date in his calendar and then deliberately did not put anything else in the notes field. No agenda items, no talking points, no strategy reminders. Just the date and the address and 2 words, their night. The invitation had been simple. A single sheet of paper, printed in English and Spanish and Somali, slipped under apartment doors and left on community bulletin boards across the east side in the days before January 11th. It said, "A community meeting for residents of Riverside East Side rental properties." It gave the address of Greater Grace Community Church on Drummond Street and the time, 7 in the evening, and it said that childcare would be provided, that dinner would be provided, and that the purpose of the meeting was to listen. Not to organize, not to protest, not to file anything or sign anything or commit to anything, just to listen and to be heard. Patricia's organization had spent a week making phone calls, knocking on doors, sitting across kitchen tables from people who had learned, through years of careful experience, that meetings where someone promised to listen were usually meetings where someone else ended up doing the talking. She had not promised outcomes. She had not made representations about what would happen next. She had simply said, "Come, tell your story if you want to. You don't have to, but the room will be there." 112 people came. They filled the main hall of Greater Grace and spilled into the corridor and the anteroom off the side entrance. There were grandmothers and young fathers and teenagers who had come with their parents and a few who had come alone. There were people who had lived in Cole's buildings for 12 years and people who had moved in 6 months ago and already knew something was wrong. There were people who had filed complaints and people who had never filed anything because they didn't know how, or because they were afraid, or because they had tried once and nothing had happened and they had decided that nothing was the only outcome available to them. 3 television cameras were set up along the side wall, invited by Patricia's organization, not by anyone connected to Charles Whitmore's team. 2 investigative journalists from the city's newspapers. A correspondent from a national housing policy publication who had been following fair housing cases in mid-size American cities, and had driven 4 hours that afternoon after getting a call that morning. And a documentary filmmaker named Soren who had been working for 2 years on a piece about housing inequality, and who would later say, in the interview that accompanied the film's release, that he had walked into Greater Grace on January 11th not knowing what to expect and had walked out knowing that he had recorded something he would spend the rest of his career trying to live up to. Charles Whitmore was not there. Eleanor Shaw was not there. Marcus Bell was not there. Patricia opened the meeting at 7:15, after the room had settled and the children had been taken downstairs and the last of the dinner plates had been cleared. She spoke for 4 minutes. She said that the purpose of the meeting was to create a space where people could speak if they chose to, and to ensure that what they said was documented and heard by people with the authority to act on it. She said that no one was required to give their name if they didn't want to. She said that legal support was available for anyone who wanted it, at no cost, and that simply attending this meeting carried no risk or obligation of any kind. Then she sat down and said, "The floor is open." A woman named Dorothy stood up first. Dorothy was 71 years old, small and deliberate in her movements, and she was carrying a manila folder that she set on the table in front of her before she began to speak. She had lived in one of Cole's buildings for 12 years. Longer than almost anyone else in the room. She had COPD, a condition she had managed reasonably well until 3 years ago, when something in the air quality of her apartment had begun triggering episodes that her previous medication regimen could not adequately control. Her doctor had asked at one of her appointments whether there were any changes in her living environment that might account for the worsening. She had gone home and looked at the ceiling of her bathroom, really looked at it for the first time in a while, and noticed that what she had assumed was ordinary discoloration was a bloom of black mold covering roughly a third of the surface area, concentrated near the ventilation duct. She had submitted a written maintenance request the following day. Then another 3 weeks later. Then a third. She had received 2 form letters acknowledging receipt of her requests and advising that the issue was under review. Then nothing. She opened the manila folder and laid the requests on the table, one beside the other. 14 of them over 3 years organized chronologically, each with the management company's acknowledgement clipped behind it. She had kept every one. "I kept them," she said, looking at the room rather than at the cameras, "because I knew that one day somebody would want to see them. I didn't know when. I just knew they needed to exist somewhere other than the shredder." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then a man named James stood up. James was 38 and worked in logistics. His 8-year-old son Marcus had been diagnosed with moderate persistent asthma 14 months ago, 18 months after they moved into their current apartment. James had asked the boy's pulmonologist, at a follow-up appointment, whether the home environment could be a factor. The doctor had said that prolonged exposure to elevated mold spore counts was a known trigger for asthma onset in children with certain genetic predispositions, and that she could not say definitively that the apartment was the cause, but that she could say definitively that the apartment was not helping. James had a letter from the pulmonologist. He had brought it. He held it up so the cameras could see it, then set it down on the table. He said, "My son is 8 years old. He carries an inhaler to school every day. He has never not carried an inhaler to school. I don't know if he would still need to carry it if we had lived somewhere else. I think about that a lot. He sat down. A young woman named Keisha stood up. She was 26 and had the manner of someone who has been angry for a long time and has refined the anger into something colder and more precise. She described the night a building manager had knocked on her door at 11 o'clock, 3 days after she had filed a formal complaint with the City Housing Authority. The manager had not been hostile. He had been pleasant, almost apologetic, in the way of a man who is delivering an offer he has delivered before and knows the recipient will consider carefully. He had offered her 2 months free rent in exchange for withdrawing the complaint and signing a non-disclosure agreement. He had a document ready. He had a pen. She had told him to leave. Her rent had been raised by $340 the following month. I still have the NDA, Keisha said. He left it on the table when he went. I kept it because I thought it was evidence of something, even if I didn't know at the time of what. I know now. She sat down and the room was very quiet again, the particular quiet of people absorbing something that confirms what they already knew, but had not yet heard said out loud by someone else. 41 people spoke that night. 26 others submitted written statements through Patricia's organization in the days that followed. The stories were not identical, but they shared a structure: the initial problem, the complaint, the form letter, the follow-up, the second form letter, the eventual silence, the accommodation of the silence because what else do you do? Some people described health consequences. Some described financial ones. Some described the specific experience of being offered things, rent reductions, lease extensions in exchange for silence, and the specific calculation they had made in each case about whether the offer was worth taking. Several people described the same building manager. A heavy-set man named Dwayne who drove a silver pickup and whose preferred approach, when complaints escalated, was to arrive in person and make the conversation personal rather than procedural. Dwayne, it emerged over the course of the evening, had not been operating independently. Multiple people recalled him referencing instructions from above, from the company, from people who made the decisions. He was a mechanism. He was not the machine. The television cameras recorded all of it. The journalists filled their notebooks. Soren moved his camera quietly through the room, not intruding, just present, the way a good documentary filmmaker is present, as a witness rather than a director. Near the end of the evening at 9:47, Naomi Carter was helped to the front of the room by her sister Gloria. She was in a wheelchair. She had been discharged from Whitmore Medical Center 2 days before. Her treatment stabilized enough for her to make the trip, and she had told her doctors that she was attending this meeting and that she was not asking for permission. The doctors had told her to take it easy. She had said she understood. She had come anyway. She positioned the wheelchair at the front of the room and looked out at the 112 people looking back at her. She had the straight-backed, collected quality that Charles had noticed on the first morning, the quality of someone who has decided exactly how they intend to be seen and is being that way on purpose. She spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Soren timed it later, reviewing the footage. She described the apartment, the air, the water, the smell that came and went, the dark patches on the wall above Zara's bed that she had repainted twice and that had come back both times. She described filtering the water because something about the tap made her daughter's stomach hurt, and not knowing until recently that there was a documented reason for that feeling. She described the maintenance requests she had submitted and the form letters she had received and the particular grinding quality of a system that is designed to look responsive without being responsive, to produce the documentation of action without the action itself. She described what it was like to be sick in that apartment. Not dramatically, not in a way that asked for sympathy, just accurately, the way a former business student and paralegal candidate describes a situation she has analyzed from every angle and understands completely. She described the way the air quality affected her lungs, which affected her immune system, which affected her kidneys, which were already failing. She described knowing that the environment was making her worse, and not being able to do anything about it, because moving required a deposit she didn't have and a reference from a landlord who had every incentive to give her a bad one. She stopped for a moment. The room was absolutely still. Then she said, "My daughter drew a picture and sent it to a stranger because she didn't know what else to do. She is 7 years old. She is the reason I am here tonight. She is the reason any of this is happening." She paused again. "I don't need Marcus Cole to apologize to me. I need him to stop." 7 words. The room stayed still for a long moment after she finished. Then someone started to clap. Not enthusiastically, not the automatic applause of a crowd responding to a performance, but slowly and deliberately, the way people applaud when they are not celebrating something but honoring it. And then the rest of the room joined, one by one, until the sound filled the hall of Greater Grace Community Church and went out through the old walls into the January night. Naomi Carter sat with her hands folded in her lap and let the sound wash over her and did not cry, because she had decided not to cry tonight, and she was a woman who, when she decided something, held to it. The documentary filmmaker's 20-minute cut was completed within a week. It was picked up by a major streaming platform 4 days after that. In its first month, it was watched by 11 million people. The clip of Naomi's 7 words, "I need him to stop," was shared 400,000 times in the first 48 hours after the film's release. Marcus Cole's PR firm called their client the morning after the church meeting and advised him that the counter-narrative was no longer viable. They used the word untenable. They said they would continue to invoice for the current month, but recommended he seek alternative counsel for the communication strategy going forward. Cole sat with that call for a long time after he hung up. He had built his defense on the premise that this was a story about 2 powerful men, and that in a story about 2 powerful men, the audience would eventually tire, eventually lose the thread, eventually turn away and leave the outcome to the institutions and the lawyers and the slow grind of process. He had built his defense on the premise that the people who had actually been harmed did not have the visibility or the voice to cut through the noise he was generating. He had been wrong about one thing. He had forgotten about Zara. Not Zara specifically. He still did not know her name, had never thought about her individually. But he had forgotten about the category of thing that Zara represented. The stubborn, inconvenient, impossible to reframe fact of a child who loves her mother and does not understand why the world is arranged the way it is arranged and asks, with total seriousness and total sincerity, whether someone might be willing to help. You cannot make that complicated. You can try. He had tried. And the trying itself had revealed the architecture of a man who needed to make simple things complicated because the simple things, left simple, were unbearable for him. The meeting at Greater Grace had not been about Charles Whitmore. It had not been about Marcus Cole. It had been about Dorothy and her 14 maintenance requests and James and his son's inhaler and Keisha and the NDA left on her kitchen table and 100 other stories that had been sitting in apartments across the East Side for years, waiting for a room and a microphone and someone who would write them down. The story belonged to them. It had always belonged to them. It just needed a 7-year-old girl with a purple crayon to remind the rest of the world that it existed. The collapse of Cole's public narrative did not mean the legal battle was over. If anything, the weeks after the church meeting were the most procedurally intense of the entire affair. Cole's attorneys, having lost the communications war, redirected every available resource into the legal proceedings, and they were formidable, and they were thorough, and they did not stop moving. Within 10 days of the Greater Grace meeting, they had filed 11 pretrial motions. A motion to dismiss the city housing complaint on the grounds that the LLC owning Magnolia East was the correct and sole party to the proceeding, and that no further liability could attach upstream without evidence of fraud, which they argued had not been established. A motion to exclude Bell's demographic analysis from any proceeding on the grounds that it was statistical inference rather than direct evidence of discriminatory intent. A motion to narrow the scope of the HUD investigation to Magnolia East only, arguing that applying findings from one property across an entire portfolio was legally impermissible. A motion challenging the chain of custody for the water test samples. A motion questioning the credentialing of the air quality tester. And 6 additional motions of varying scope and specificity, each designed to consume time to force responses, to create friction in the machinery of the proceedings. Eleanor Shaw's team answered every one. They had anticipated most of them. The demographic analysis challenge they had specifically prepared for. They had retained a statistician from the state university whose specialty was discrimination pattern analysis and whose testimony on methodology was, by the end, unassailable. The chain of custody challenge collapsed when Bell produced a complete photographic and time-stamped record of every sample taken. The LLC liability motion was the most serious, and it occupied the most time, and Eleanor addressed it with the argument she had been building since December. The maintenance log from 18 months ago, signed by a Lakeview Property Services employee, had been forwarded to the holding company's central operations email within 24 hours of being filed. That email had been produced in discovery. The holding company had known. The holding company was controlled by Cole. The fraudulent certification of a system that was already failing was not a matter of a subsidiary acting independently. It was a matter of a man who knew and chose and continued. The fraud argument pierced the LLC. All 11 motions were denied within 6 weeks. Discovery was extensive. Cole's attorneys fought every document request, and Eleanor fought back each time. And the federal subpoena from HUD cut through several impasses that the civil discovery process could not resolve on its own. What came out of discovery, over 4 months of back and forth, was a picture that no single piece of evidence could have assembled alone. There were internal emails. A thread from 14 months ago in which a regional manager had flagged the Magnolia East ventilation system to the central operations team and been told, in 3 words, "Not now, budget." A follow-up email 2 months later, noting that a tenant had filed a formal complaint with the city and asking how to respond. The reply, standard acknowledgement, log is under review, no action required. A third email 7 months ago, from the same manager, noting that the water filtration issue had been identified and asking whether a repair contractor should be engaged. The reply, hold pending portfolio review. Portfolio review. The sale to Meridian had been in negotiation for 8 months. The decision not to repair the water filtration unit had been made in the context of that negotiation. Spending money on a building that was about to be sold at a price based on land value rather than building condition was, in the internal calculus of Cole's operation, irrational. The building's condition did not affect the sale price. It only affected the people living in it. There were financial records. The maintenance cost line across all 28 buildings, tracked over 5 years, ran at approximately 14% of the industry standard for comparable portfolio size. The paper losses generated by that suppressed maintenance figure had reduced Cole's taxable income by an average of $4 million per year. Multiplied by 5 years, that was $20 million in avoided taxation, achieved by the specific mechanism of not fixing the things that were making his tenants sick. There was the testimony of the former property management employee, a woman named Sandra who had worked in Cole's regional office for 4 years and left 18 months ago citing ethical concerns in her resignation letter. She described the maintenance triage system explicitly. Complaints were categorized on receipt as urgent, standard, or cosmetic. Urgent meant fire, flood, structural collapse. Everything else was standard or cosmetic, and standard or cosmetic meant the form letter, the acknowledgement, the log entry, the file closed. She described raising the ventilation issue at Magnolia East with her supervisor and being told it was on the list. She described asking 6 months later why it was still on the list and being told that the portfolio was under strategic review and non-urgent maintenance was on hold. She described the tenant sorting guidance she had received in her first month, which buildings were appropriate for which applicant profiles, phrased in language that was carefully indirect but whose meaning in practice she had understood immediately and had complied with for 4 years before she stopped complying and resigned. "I told myself it was just how the industry worked," Sandra said in her deposition, her voice level and without excuse. "I was wrong about that. It is how some parts of the industry work." That's not the same thing. The civil class action trial began in March and lasted 9 days. Cole's attorneys made their final arguments with skill and precision. They were good lawyers doing everything good lawyers could do for a client whose position the evidence had fundamentally compromised. They argued ambiguity where the record was clear. They argued alternative explanations where the pattern was consistent. They argued that correlation was not causation, and that intent could not be inferred from outcome, and that the LLC structure was standard and legal, and had been used by every major property developer in the state for decades. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned on a Thursday afternoon in late March, and the foreperson, a retired schoolteacher named Barbara who had lived for 20 years in the east side of the city, read the verdicts in a clear, unhurried voice. Liable on the Fair Housing Act discrimination count. Liable on the negligence per se count arising from the documented violations. Liable on the intentional misrepresentation count related to the fraudulent maintenance logs. Liable on the negligent infliction of harm count related to the health consequences documented in the medical records of 17 plaintiff households. Compensatory damages, $28 million for $100,000, distributed proportionally across the 67 plaintiff households, according to a formula that weighted duration of tenancy and documented health impact. Punitive damages, $14,800,000, the statutory maximum available under state law, awarded on the finding of intentional and discriminatory conduct. Total, $43,200,000. Cole sat at the defense table and heard the numbers read out, and his expression did not change. He had been in business for 20 years and had trained his face over those years to be a professional instrument, and it remained one now. But the man sitting beside him, his lead attorney, who had seen many verdicts, noticed that Cole's hand, resting on the table, had closed into a fist between the compensatory and punitive figures and had not opened again. The verdict included a finding of intentional discrimination under the Fair Housing Act, which carried separate federal consequences. The Department of Justice, which had been monitoring the civil proceedings, opened a parallel civil rights investigation the following week. The State Attorney General's office, which had received the criminal referral in December, announced that a grand jury had been convened to consider charges of wire fraud and tax evasion. Cole's attorneys filed notice of appeal the same afternoon as the verdict. It was the correct procedural move, and it changed nothing about the immediate consequences. His passport was surrendered to the court. He could not leave the state. The appeal would take years. The verdict was the verdict. All 28 buildings were placed under court-supervised management. The remediation program began within 30 days, funded from the punitive damages award. Every building received a full ventilation inspection and repair. Water filtration systems were replaced across the entire portfolio. Mold remediation was completed unit by unit, with tenants temporarily housed in hotel rooms at the estate's expense during the work. Elevators were repaired. The common areas were cleaned, repainted, lit properly. Dorothy's building got a new ventilation system in the first week of April. She stood in her apartment on the day the contractors finished and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth slowly, the way her pulmonologist had taught her, and noted that the air tasted different, cleaner. She sat down at her kitchen table and looked at the empty manila folder. She had turned the 14 maintenance requests over to Eleanor's team as evidence, and they were now part of the official court record. And she thought that this was probably as close as she was ever going to get to the specific feeling she had been trying to name for 3 years. She decided the word for it was, finally. The name Marcus Cole disappeared from the bronze plaques of the 2 nonprofit housing organizations he had chaired. It disappeared from the advisory board roster of the Fair Housing Coalition. The mayor's office returned his last campaign contribution without comment. The Business Journal ran a follow-up piece, much shorter than the original profile, headlined, "Developer Convicted of Housing Discrimination, Faces Criminal Inquiry." The photograph they used was a courtroom sketch rather than the promotional portrait from the original article. He looked smaller in the sketch, less certain of the light. None of it felt like enough to the 67 families who had lived through what they had lived through. Verdicts are not restoration. Money distributed according to a formula across years of harm cannot fully account for a child who grew up with asthma, or a grandmother who spent 3 years breathing air that made her sicker, or a woman who had been living in an environment that accelerated the progression of a terminal illness while trying to finish her paralegal certification and read to her daughter every night even when her hands hurt. But the buildings were being fixed. The tenants were not being evicted. The man who had spent 12 years treating their suffering as a line item on a balance sheet was sitting in a courtroom while a foreperson read out $43 million, and then surrendering his passport to an officer of the court. And on a Thursday morning in April, 6 weeks after the verdict, Naomi Carter was wheeled into an operating room at Whitmore Medical Center for a kidney transplant. The donor was a 29-year-old woman in Portland, Oregon. Her name was Danielle. She had been a registered organ donor. She had died 3 days earlier from a brain aneurysm, and her family had honored the wish she had written down years ago on a small card and carried in her wallet. Naomi would think about Danielle often in the years that followed, would think about the specific, unremarkable act of carrying that card, of writing that wish down, of not knowing that the writing of it would matter in the exact way that it mattered, at exactly the time that it mattered, to exactly the person it mattered to. The surgery lasted 6 hours and 50 minutes. Zara spent those 6 hours and 50 minutes in the waiting room with her Aunt Gloria. She had brought a coloring book but did not use it. Instead, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the door to the surgical wing and waited with the absolute, focused patience of a child who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has learned that waiting is not passive. It is a thing you do with your whole body, with your whole attention directed at the door. When Dr. Patricia Osei came through that door at 2:17 in the afternoon and said the words, "Your mom came through beautifully, the kidney is functioning, she is stable and resting," Zara nodded once slowly, the way a person nods when they have been carrying a very heavy thing for a long time and someone has just taken it gently from their arms. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. "I made this for after," she told her Aunt Gloria. "I've been keeping it." She unfolded it. It was a drawing. 2 figures standing in front of a building with light in all its windows. A garden below them. Children playing. A dog that was more oval than dog. A sky with stars and a sun simultaneously because Zara was 7 years old and did not see why you had to choose. In the corner in purple, home. Gloria put her arm around her niece and held her close and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The drawing was exactly right. August came to Riverside the way August always does, slowly, then all at once, the heat settling into the city like something that had always intended to stay. The jacaranda trees along Drummond Street had bloomed and shed their purple flowers in June, and now the sidewalks were dry and the mornings were still cool for about an hour after sunrise before the day asserted itself fully and without apology. 8 months had passed since a yellow envelope with duck stickers on the flap had arrived on the corner of a desk on the 42nd floor of a building on Grand Avenue. Magnolia East looked different in August. The pale brick had been cleaned, not replaced, not refaced, but properly cleaned for the first time in what the contractors estimated was at least 15 years, and the color that emerged from beneath the decades of grime and water stain was warmer than anyone had expected. Not cream, not quite terracotta, something between the two, the color of a building that had been waiting patiently for someone to notice it was still there. The gutters were new. The downspouts were properly attached and properly sealed. The windows on every floor had been reglazed, and in the August morning light they caught the sun and sent it back in clean rectangles across the sidewalk below. The lobby had been repainted. The intercom panel had been fully replaced. Every button labeled, every connection functional, tested and certified by a contractor who had submitted a report to the court-appointed supervisor, rather than to a management company that would file it and forget it. The elevator doors were no longer papered with handwritten signs. The elevator had worked without interruption for 4 months. In the courtyard between Magnolia East and the building adjacent to it, a courtyard that had previously been a cracked concrete rectangle used primarily for garbage staging, a garden had been planted. Not a grand garden, not a designed landscape. A practical one. Raised beds built by residents over 3 consecutive weekends in May, filled with soil donated by a local nursery, planted with vegetables chosen by the families who had claimed the beds. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, one ambitious attempt at watermelon by a 12-year-old named Marcus, who had read that watermelons needed more space than he'd allocated, and was monitoring the situation with the focused anxiety of someone who has committed to a course of action and is now discovering its full implications. The garden was Dorothy's idea. She had proposed it at the first meeting of the new resident council, the governing body that now had actual authority over decisions affecting the building, 4 of its 7 seats held by people who lived there. Dorothy was on the council. So was James. So was Keisha, who had been elected vice chair on the first ballot, and who ran the meetings with the efficient precision of someone who had spent years watching meetings be run badly, and had clear ideas about how to do it correctly. The community board in the lobby had a new feature. A wooden box beside it with a slot in the top and a hand-lettered card that read "Your voice matters here. Always." The card had been lettered by Zara in purple marker. Standing on a step stool in the lobby on the Saturday morning the board went up, her tongue between her teeth in concentration, the letters uneven in size but even in intention. Naomi had watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame. She was standing without assistance. Had been since June. Her kidney function at the 6-month post-transplant check had tested at 69%, well above what her doctors had projected as the realistic outcome, and within the range that would allow her to lead what her nephrologist described, with the careful optimism of someone who has seen outcomes go both ways, as a substantially normal life. She was taking immunosuppressants and would take them for the rest of her life. She had follow-up appointments every 3 months. She tired more easily than she had before the illness and probably always would. These were the terms. She had accepted them without complaint, which was not the same as accepting them without awareness. She knew exactly what they cost and exactly what they gave her in return, and she had done the calculation and found it, without question, worth it. She had started her new job in July. The housing rights legal clinic occupied 2 floors of a building on the west side of downtown, shared with 3 other nonprofit organizations, and a food bank that operated out of the ground floor. Her title was paralegal associate. Her caseload in the first month had included a family facing eviction on procedurally improper grounds, 2 tenants dealing with landlords who had refused to return security deposits without cause, and 1 elderly man whose lease contained a maintenance waiver clause that his attorney had told him was unenforceable, which turned out to be correct, a finding that the man had received with the particular satisfaction of someone who had suspected this for years and was glad to have it confirmed. She was good at it. Her supervising attorney had told her so at the end of the first month, in the direct, unembellished way of someone who gives compliments sparingly and means them when she does. Naomi had said thank you and meant that too. She and Zara had not moved from Magnolia East. This surprised some people who assumed that a fresh start would require a fresh location, that staying was a form of being stuck. Naomi had thought about it carefully, the way she thought about most things, and had arrived at a conclusion that she explained to her sister Gloria one evening over dinner. The building was not the problem. The system that had allowed the building to become what it had become was the problem. The building itself was just bricks and windows and the accumulated lives of the people who had lived in it, and those lives were not a reason to leave. They were a reason to stay and make sure the building became what it should have been. Also, Zara's school was 2 blocks away, and the bus now stopped directly in front. Charles Whitmore came to the first anniversary celebration of the resident council in August. He had been invited. Patricia's organization had added him to the list without fanfare, as a guest rather than a guest of honor, and he had accepted in the same spirit. He drove himself. He arrived a few minutes after the event started, found a place near the back of the courtyard where the folding tables had been set up with food that various residents had brought, and he stood there with a paper plate of something that turned out to be an extraordinary jerk chicken made by a Jamaican grandmother from the 3rd floor named Vera, and he watched. He watched Dorothy talking to a group of younger residents with the authority of a woman who has earned her standing over 12 years of carefully documented patience. He watched James's son, the boy with the asthma, 8 years old, name also Marcus, chasing the 12-year-old watermelon farmer around the garden beds with the specific energy of a child who has had a good summer. He watched Keisha managing the sign-in table with one hand and her phone with the other, simultaneously greeting arrivals and responding to a text thread that appeared, from a distance, to involve a considerable degree of capitalization. He watched Naomi Carter standing near the garden in the August afternoon light, talking to a neighbor he hadn't met, laughing at something the neighbor said. A real laugh, full and sudden. The laugh of a woman who is not conserving her energy for something more important because nothing right now is more important than this conversation, this moment, this ordinary and extraordinary fact of being alive and well, and standing in a garden in August. He had not seen her laugh before. He realized, watching her, that every time he had seen her she had been managing something. Managing her illness, managing her dignity, managing the conversation, managing the careful calibration of how much to reveal and how much to hold back. This was different. This was her, unmanaged, in a moment that required nothing from her except to be present in it. He looked away after a moment because some things are not meant to be observed. They are meant to be allowed. Patricia found him near the food table and they talked for a while about the council, about the community land trust structure, about what the next year of work looked like. She told him about 2 other buildings in the city that were showing similar patterns to what Belle had found at Magnolia East. Not Cole's buildings, different owners, different structures, but the same logic underneath. She said her organization was beginning to build the documentation. He said he would like to support that work, quietly, in the same arrangement as before. She said that was acceptable. They shook hands. At some point in the early evening, as the light began to go golden and the shadows of the garden beds stretched long across the courtyard, Zara found him. He had not seen her approach. One moment he was standing alone watching the party, and the next moment she was beside him, her head approximately level with his elbow, wearing a yellow dress and sandals and the expression of a person who has located the individual they were looking for and is now deciding how to begin. "Hello, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Hello, Zara," he said. "You look well." "I am well," she said, with the precision of a child who has learned the difference between a social formality and a factual report and prefers the latter. "Mama is well too. In case you were going to ask." "I was," he said. "Thank you." She nodded. Then she reached into a small bag she was carrying, a cloth bag with a sunflower printed on it, and produced a yellow envelope, smaller than the first one. No duck stickers this time. His name on the front in purple crayon, the letters a little more even than before, the handwriting of a child who had been practicing. "You can open it later," she said, with the authority of someone who has given this instruction before and found it works best when stated rather than suggested. "Not now. Later. When you're in the car or at home." "All right," he said. She nodded once more, satisfied. Then she said, "Did you know watermelons need a lot more space than Marcus gave them?" "I did not know that." He didn't either. He knows now. She paused, looking toward the garden with the assessing expression of someone reviewing a situation they have strong opinions about. "I think it's going to be okay though. I looked it up. They can grow sideways if they need to." "That's a good thing to know," Charles said. "Most things can," Zara said. "Grow sideways if they need to." Then she went back to her friends, moving through the party with the ease of a child entirely at home in the place where she is. And Charles stood holding the yellow envelope and watching the courtyard fill up with the ordinary gold of an August evening, and he thought that was probably one of the wisest things anyone had said to him in a very long time. He opened the envelope in his car, engine off, parked on Drummond Street with the sounds of the party still faint through the closed windows. Inside was a drawing. Crayon again, the full set from the richness of the colors, but different from the first one. More confident. The lines more certain, the proportions more considered, the whole thing more fully realized, the way drawings are when a child has had 8 months to grow into their own hand. 2 figures. One tall, one small. Standing in front of a building he recognized immediately. The warm brick, the clean windows, the garden below. The tall figure had the same crown of tight purple spirals. The small one had her pom-pom hat, tilted at the same angle because some things do not need to change. Around them, the garden, children playing, a sun and stars sharing the same sky without contradiction, a dog that was making its best effort. In the top corner, in letters that were careful and even and unhurried, for M.R. Whitmore. And below the drawing in pencil, each word placed with the same deliberateness as the first letter. 8 months ago, on the corner of a desk he had almost not looked up from. "Thank you for listening. The stars are still hard, but I am getting better at them. Love, Zara, age 8. He sat in the parked car for a long time. 30 years of decisions. Acquisitions and restructurings and integrations and the long, relentless arithmetic of building something large out of smaller things. Hundreds of millions moved and managed. Problems solved and, if he was honest with himself, problems created. The ordinary moral ledger of a life spent in the machinery of commerce, where intentions and consequences do not always point in the same direction, and you learn, if you are paying attention, to hold both without pretending either one cancels the other out. He thought about the first letter, about reading it 3 times and stopping on the same line each time. He thought about climbing 4 flights of stairs in a building that smelled of mold and finding a woman studying contract law in a bed she couldn't get out of, and a child who had decided that the most useful thing she could do was draw a picture and send it to a stranger and ask, plainly and without embarrassment, for help. He thought about Eleanor saying, "This is not your story to manage." He thought about Patricia saying, "Most people who fund us want their name on the building." He thought about Naomi saying, "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to give me a room and a microphone." He thought about Dorothy and her manila folder and Keisha and the NDA and James and the letter from the pulmonologist and the 111 other people who had come to Greater Grace Community Church on a January night because someone had finally made a room for them to walk into. He thought about Zara, 8 months ago, closing the door of apartment 4C and leaving him in the hallway with the smell of mold in the air and the drawing in his hand and the words still forming in his mind. "Find out who owns this building." All the way down. He thought about what she had just said in the courtyard, without knowing she was saying anything in particular, in the voice of a child who is not yet old enough to know that the things she says are the kind of thing adults spend decades trying to understand. Most things can grow sideways if they need to. He looked at the drawing again. The building with the warm windows. The garden. The sun and the stars sharing the same sky because a child who draws does not see why they cannot coexist. The 2 figures with the orange line between them, hand in hand, the same line that had been in the first drawing, unbroken, unhurried, the simplest possible statement of the most important possible fact. He thought, "I almost didn't look up." He thought, "That is the thing I will carry. Not the verdict. Not the remediation. Not the $43 million or the federal investigation or the precedent that Eleanor's team had established and that housing attorneys across the country were already citing in cases of their own. Those were the outcomes, real, necessary, insufficient, as all outcomes are when measured against the full weight of what made them necessary. What he would carry was the moment before any of it. The yellow envelope on the corner of his desk. The choice to put down the acquisition proposal and pick it up instead. The 4 flights of stairs. The knocked door. The sound of a chain being slid back by a child who had decided, after a moment's consideration, to let him in. The greatest help does not begin with money, or with power, or with the particular advantages that accumulate over 30 years of building something large. It begins with the willingness to stop. To look up from the thing in front of you at the thing that is also there, that has always been there, that will keep being there until someone decides it is worth the interruption. A 7-year-old girl had decided that he was worth the interruption. He had tried to be. He folded the drawing carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the yellow envelope and set it on the passenger seat. Then he sat for another minute with his hands resting on the wheel, listening to the faint sounds of the party still going on in the courtyard of Magnolia East. Laughter, music from someone's phone, the particular bright noise of children running in a space they have claimed as their own. He started the car. He drove home through the warm August evening, through streets that looked from the ground exactly the way they had always looked, complicated, imperfect, full of lives proceeding at their own pace toward their own conclusions. The Christmas lights were long gone from the lampposts on Grand Avenue. The scaffolding on the old Meridian block had been taken down. The city went on the way cities go on, carrying everything that had happened in it and everything that was still happening, and most of it invisible from any single vantage point, and most of it mattering more than it was possible to know. In the passenger seat, in a yellow envelope, a drawing of a building with lights in all its windows waited to be put somewhere it could be seen every day. He already knew where he was going to put it. Not on the wall of his office 42 floors above the city. On his desk. At eye level. Where you couldn't miss it even if you tried. You stayed all the way to the end. That means something. Now we need 3 things from you. Keycap 1, tell us in the comments, which moment across all 7 parts stayed with you the longest? Zara's first letter? Naomi refusing charity? Dorothy's manila folder? The 7 words? The drawing that said home? The watermelon? Keycap 2, share this story right now with one person who needs to read it today. Not tomorrow. Today. Because there are Naomis in every city. There are Zaras in every city. And there are people who just need to be reminded that picking up the envelope, that choosing to look up is always worth it. Keycap 3, one word. That's all. Leave one word in the comments that describes how you feel right now. We will read every single one. Thank you for listening.